A billionaire thought he could crush a poor black janitor in a dark parking lot. But what he didn't know was that this ordinary woman carried a hidden military past, one that would flip the hunter into the hunted and shake his entire empire to the core. Let's continue this story. It all started with a sound most people would overlook: the sharp click of high-end leather shoes striking against the smooth cement of an underground parking lot. To anyone else, it was just a man walking, but to Maria, it was the sound of arrogance carried on every step. She tightened her grip on the mop handle in her hands, her work uniform faintly smelling of bleach, as the billionaire strode past her without so much as a glance. His name was Richard Kane, a man whose face often appeared on magazine covers with headlines that painted him as a genius entrepreneur, a self-made success story, a philanthropist even. But Maria knew better. She had seen him bark orders at his employees, dismiss security guards like they were disposable tools, and tonight, she was about to see a side of him that the glossy pages would never print. Maria was sweeping near the exit ramp, her head down, when Richard's expensive car, a sleek black sedan that looked like it belonged in a commercial, pulled into the space closest to the elevator. He stepped out, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. At first, he ignored her, busy adjusting his cufflinks. But then his eyes fell on the janitor crouched by the concrete pillar, and something in his face shifted. He frowned, like her very existence in his vicinity was an offense. "Hey," he snapped, his voice cutting through the stillness of the lot. "You missed a spot. Right there. Do you people ever do your jobs properly?" His tone was sharp, dismissive, like a whip cracking through the air. Maria's jaw clenched. She wasn't the type to argue, not anymore. But she wasn't the type to be humiliated either. She gave a quiet nod, moved the mop, and kept her focus on the floor. That should have been the end of it. But Richard wasn't finished. Maybe it was the stress of his business deal that had gone south that day. Maybe it was the wine he had consumed at dinner. Or maybe it was simply his nature, the need to assert control. Whatever it was, he took a step closer. "Look at me when I talk to you," he barked. She lifted her gaze, calm and steady, meeting his piercing eyes. For a brief second, he looked unsettled. Most people dropped their eyes around him. But not her. He sneered. "What's with that look? You think you're better than me because you're holding a mop? You're nothing." He moved faster than Maria expected, his hand shooting out, fingers closing tightly around her throat. The mop clattered to the ground, the echo ringing through the parking structure. The billionaire's grip was iron hard, fueled by entitlement more than strength. Her back pressed against the cold concrete pillar, and for a moment, it must have looked like Richard Kane was teaching a lowly janitor her place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Maria had once worn a uniform too. Not a janitor's, but a soldier's. She had trained in deserts and jungles, learned to disarm men twice his size, and had stared down threats far greater than this arrogant executive. Her past wasn't something she spoke about. She had left it behind after returning from her final deployment. But muscle memory doesn't vanish. Instinct doesn't forget. Maria's eyes didn't widen in fear. They narrowed. Slowly, she reached up, not to pry his hand off, but to press her palm against his wrist, shifting her body just slightly. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable, until in one fluid motion, she twisted her weight, locking his arm and forcing him backward with a precision that spoke of training, not chance. Richard let out a strangled yelp as his own wrist bent at an unnatural angle, his grip breaking instantly. He stumbled, crashing into the hood of his own car, stunned and breathless. Maria stood tall, her chest rising and falling, her eyes sharp with a calm that unnerved him. She didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't gloat. She simply picked up her mop, as if nothing had happened, and leaned it against the wall. Richard pushed himself upright, his face burning with humiliation more than pain. No one had ever dared to resist him, let alone flip the situation so effortlessly. "You," he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You're going to regret this. Do you know who I am? I could ruin your life with a single phone call." Maria tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You already tried," she said softly, her voice even but laced with something he couldn't quite place: steel. For the first time in years, Richard Kane felt something he wasn't used to feeling in his own territory: unease. He tried to shake it off, straightening his tie, pretending to regain control. "Don't think this is over," he hissed, retreating toward the elevator. People like you don't last long when you cross men like me. The elevator doors closed behind him, but his words hung heavy in the air. Maria exhaled slowly, the faintest flicker of something buried deep surfacing in her chest. She had wanted a quiet life, a life where no one knew what she was capable of. But tonight had drawn a line, and whether she liked it or not, she knew Richard Kane wasn't the kind of man to let go, and she wasn't the kind of woman to bow down. Richard Kane sat in the back of his limousine later that night, his hand still aching from the way it had been twisted. He replayed the moment over and over, his jaw tightening every time he saw her eyes in his memory. That calm stare, that defiance, it gnawed at him. People feared him, respected him, or at least pretended to. But that janitor? She had humiliated him in his own space, and that was something he could not allow. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but quickly looked away when he noticed Richard's glare. "Everything all right, sir?" the driver asked cautiously. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and smirked. "Oh, everything's fine. By tomorrow, she won't even have a job. And soon after, she won't have a life worth living." Maria, meanwhile, returned to her small apartment across town. It was a modest place, the kind of home that whispered of someone who didn't care much for material things. Her walls were bare except for a single framed photo of her in uniform with her unit. Faces smiling despite the dust and exhaustion. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, her hands steady, though her mind wouldn't rest. Richard's threats didn't scare her, but they irritated her. She had seen men like him before. Arrogant commanders who believed power gave them immunity. Wealthy contractors who thought they could buy loyalty with money and discard people when they were no longer useful. They all bled the same when reality caught up to them. The next morning at work, Maria noticed the whispers. Co-workers avoided her gaze. Supervisors glanced at her with a nervous edge, and by noon, she was called into the manager's office. A man with thinning hair and a forced smile handed her a paper. "Maria, I'm sorry, but we've been told your services are no longer required here." She studied the paper without blinking, then folded it neatly. "Richard Kane?" she asked quietly. The manager's eyes darted away. That was answer enough. Maria stood, gave him a polite nod, and left without a word. She didn't fight it. She knew this wasn't the end. This was only his first move. Richard thought cutting her off from her job would break her, but instead, it ignited something dormant inside her. Maria had spent years burying her past, trying to live as an ordinary civilian, but Richard had crossed a line. He had tried to choke her into silence, and now he was trying to erase her livelihood. She wasn't going to attack him head-on, not yet. She knew men like him operated in shadows, protected by money, lawyers, and influence. But she also knew every empire had cracks, and she had the patience to find them. That evening, Maria followed Richard's car, not up close, but far enough to remain unnoticed. She wasn't a trained spy, but her military instincts gave her an edge. She watched him leave his office tower and head straight to an upscale restaurant where he dined with politicians and other power players. She noticed how he laughed too loudly, how his gestures grew animated when he bragged about his latest project. The man loved attention, but more importantly, he loved control. And people like that always underestimated those they considered beneath them. Richard, unaware of her quiet observation, spent the evening plotting his next move. He had already called in a private investigator to dig up dirt on Maria. When the PI returned with the report, Richard was disappointed. "She's clean," the man said. "No criminal record, no scandals. She's ex-military, honorable discharge, decorated for service. She lives alone, keeps to herself. Nothing I can use against her." Richard's face darkened. "Then find something. Everyone has a weakness. Everyone." He poured himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She thinks she can embarrass me? I'll make her wish she never laid eyes on me." But Maria wasn't just sitting idly. She had her own sources, old comrades who owed her favors, contacts who could access things not available to the public. She started gathering information about Richard's business dealings, and what she found didn't surprise her. Fraudulent contracts, offshore accounts, bribery of local officials. It was all there, buried under layers of legal paperwork and false fronts. Richard Kane wasn't a genius entrepreneur. He was a parasite feeding on others. Maria knew exposing him outright wouldn't be easy. He had lawyers and media connections ready to spin any story. But if she could get under his skin, If she could make him slip up publicly, his empire would crumble from the inside. The first crack appeared sooner than Richard expected. At a charity gala the following week, Richard was making a speech about generosity and giving back to the community when he spotted Maria at the edge of the crowd. She wasn't in her janitor's uniform anymore. She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, but she stood tall and composed. Their eyes met across the room, and Richard's voice faltered for the briefest second. The audience didn't notice, but Maria did. She gave him a faint smile, not mocking, not threatening, just calm. That smile unnerved him more than any shouted insult could have. After the gala, Richard stormed to his car, barking orders at his bodyguards. "I don't care what it takes. Get her away from me. I don't want her near me, near my events, near my company. Do whatever you have to do." His men nodded, ready to act. But Maria wasn't afraid of bodyguards. She had dealt with worse. She knew Richard was spiraling, and the more he tried to crush her, the more reckless he would become. And reckless men always made mistakes. As she walked home that night, Maria passed a group of young janitors huddled near a bus stop, talking quietly about their low pay and harsh supervisors. They looked tired, defeated. Maria stopped, listened for a moment, then offered a word of encouragement. "Don't let anyone tell you you're less than them. Remember, strength isn't about money. It's about what you can endure and how you rise again." They looked at her, surprised by the weight in her tone, and though they didn't know her story, they felt the truth behind her words. Maria wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She realized Richard represented something larger. Every arrogant man who thought power made him untouchable, and she was ready to show him how wrong he was. Richard Kane wasn't the type to let things slip. The sight of Maria at the gala haunted him for days. He felt her calm stare in his sleep, the quiet defiance that stripped away his illusion of control. For a man who thrived on dominance, it was intolerable. So he did what men like him always did when fear gnawed at their pride. He doubled down. He summoned 2 of his most trusted bodyguards, men built like walls, with shaved heads and cold eyes. In his office, overlooking the glittering skyline, he leaned back in his leather chair and gave the order. "Find her. Teach her a lesson. Make sure she understands what happens when she crosses me." The bodyguards nodded without question. They didn't care about morality or justice. They cared about the stacks of cash Richard paid them. That night, they tracked Maria to her apartment. They waited in the shadows across the street, watching the light in her window flicker before going dark. Around midnight, they moved in, confident in their size and strength. But Maria wasn't an ordinary target, and she had sensed their presence hours earlier. Her military training had sharpened her awareness to every shift in the environment. The crunch of footsteps on gravel, the faint sound of a lighter clicking as one of the men lit a cigarette, the unnatural stillness of the street when predators waited in silence. When they forced her door open, expecting to corner her, they found nothing but an empty room. A voice came from behind them, low and steady. "Looking for me?" They spun around, only to see Maria step out of the shadows of the hallway. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes locked onto them with precision. The first man charged, swinging his fist like a hammer, but Maria sidestepped gracefully, her elbow driving into his ribs with surgical accuracy. The second man lunged, trying to grab her, but she pivoted, sweeping his legs out from under him. They hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the small apartment. Maria didn't go further. She didn't need to. Within seconds, both men were groaning on the floor, their confidence shattered. She crouched beside them, her voice calm but cutting. "Tell your boss I'm not afraid of him. And if he sends you again, you won't be leaving on your feet." She let them scramble out, limping and clutching their bruises, the message delivered loud and clear. The next morning, Richard received the report. Instead of cowing Maria into submission, his men had been humiliated. His face turned red with rage, his knuckles white as he slammed his fist onto the desk. "She's mocking me," he growled. "A janitor. A nobody." His assistant stood nervously nearby, afraid to speak. Richard paced the length of his office like a predator in a cage. He wasn't used to losing control, but Maria was forcing him to confront something he couldn't understand. Someone who couldn't be bought, silenced, or intimidated. Maria, on the other hand, went about her day with quiet resolve. She had no interest in vengeance for its own sake. But Richard had crossed boundaries she couldn't ignore. She thought about the people who worked under him, The ones who whispered their complaints in break rooms. The ones who lived in fear of losing their jobs with a snap of his fingers. She thought about the younger janitors she had encouraged, and she realized this wasn't just her battle anymore. Richard represented every abusive system she had fought against her whole life. She had seen dictators crumble overseas, men with armies behind them fall because of their arrogance. And she knew Richard Kane was no different, just another man drunk on power. But Richard wasn't finished. He escalated again, this time using his influence. Within days, Maria's landlord received a call. Suddenly, her rent was raised beyond what she could afford, and eviction notices began appearing at her door. Her bank account froze unexpectedly, tied up in suspicious activity, claims that Richard's people had engineered. Everywhere she turned, the billionaire's reach tried to suffocate her. But Maria didn't panic. She had lived through worse. Nights in war zones with no food, days under fire with no guarantee of survival. Compared to that, Richard's petty games were nothing but noise. Instead of retreating, Maria began to strike back. Quietly, methodically, she reached out to one of her old comrades, Luis, a former intelligence officer who now worked in cybersecurity. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, she explained the situation. Luis leaned back, whistling softly. "You've got yourself a real snake," he said. "Good thing snakes always leave trails." Within a week, Luis had uncovered layers of Richard's corruption. Offshore accounts tied to shell companies, secret recordings of him bribing city officials, hidden documents showing how he underpaid and exploited his workers. Maria knew it was enough to ruin him, but she didn't rush. Timing was everything. Meanwhile, Richard's paranoia grew. He began seeing Maria's face everywhere, in the lobby of his office building, in the reflections of car windows, in the crowds outside his events. She wasn't following him all the time, but the thought that she could be drove him insane. He started drinking more, yelling at his staff, making rash decisions in meetings. Investors grew uneasy, sensing cracks in his empire. But still, he convinced himself that if he could just eliminate Maria, everything would go back to normal. One evening, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, distorted, almost mocking. He poured himself another drink, muttering under his breath, "She's just a janitor. Just a janitor." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Maria wasn't just a janitor. She was the one person he couldn't control. And for the first time in his life, Richard Kane was terrified. Across town, Maria sat at her kitchen table again, reviewing the files Luis had gathered. Her tea had gone cold, but she didn't notice. She was focused on one thing, ending Richard Kane, not with fists or violence, but with the truth he had buried for so long. She thought back to the moment his hand closed around her throat in that parking lot. He had wanted to break her. Instead, he had awakened a part of her that refused to stay silent. And now, the man who thought he was untouchable was about to learn that even the strongest towers could crumble when struck at the foundation. The city was buzzing with talk of Richard Kane's latest project, a multi-million-dollar development that promised jobs, luxury housing, and prestige. The media painted him as a visionary, but Maria knew the truth. Behind the glossy press releases and photo ops lay fraud, exploitation, and broken promises. With Luis's help, she pieced together the evidence like a puzzle, every document and recording forming a picture of corruption so blatant it was almost laughable. But Maria didn't plan to dump it all at once. She wanted Richard to feel the ground shift slowly beneath him, to realize his empire wasn't as solid as he believed. Her first move was subtle. An anonymous package arrived at the office of a well-known journalist, one who had spent years trying to expose corporate corruption but always ran into dead ends. Inside was a single folder, proof that Richard had bribed inspectors to overlook safety violations in his construction sites. Nothing too explosive yet, just enough to spark curiosity and questions. Days later, headlines began to circulate. Are Richard Kane's buildings safe? Investors frowned, city officials scrambled, and Richard slammed his fist onto his desk when he read the news. "This is her," he hissed. "It has to be her." His assistant tried to calm him, suggesting they issue a statement of denial, but Richard's paranoia was boiling over. He knew Maria was behind this, even if he couldn't prove it. And knowing she was out there, unseen, made him feel like a cornered animal. He increased his security, ordered his staff to track her down, but every effort failed. Maria moved like smoke, present, undeniable, but impossible to grasp. Meanwhile, Maria kept her routine simple. She volunteered at a shelter, helped neighbors carry groceries, and maintained the appearance of an ordinary life. To anyone looking in, she was just another woman getting by. But beneath that calm surface, she was orchestrating a quiet storm. She leaked another piece of evidence: financial records showing how Richard funneled money into offshore accounts to avoid taxes. The public backlash grew louder. News channels invited analysts to question his ethics, while protesters gathered outside his offices with signs that read, "Justice for workers," and "Kane cheats the city." Richard's once untouchable image began to crack. At meetings, board members avoided eye contact, murmuring about whether his leadership was sustainable. Investors pulled out of deals. For the first time, Richard Kane wasn't being celebrated. He was being questioned. And that terrified him more than Maria's fists ever could. One night, he sat alone in his penthouse again, his drink untouched, staring at his phone. He scrolled through articles, each one tarnishing his reputation. His chest tightened with a mixture of rage and fear. He thought about calling Maria directly, demanding she stop, but he didn't even have her number. She had all the control now, and he hated it. In desperation, he turned to the only thing he trusted: violence. He hired a new crew, not just bodyguards this time, but men with darker reputations. These weren't protectors, they were hunters. Their job was simple: find Maria, silence her, by any means necessary. But Maria was ready. The night they came for her, she wasn't at home. She had deliberately left the lights on, a decoy. When the men broke in, expecting to find her asleep, they found themselves met with silence, and then the wail of police sirens. Maria had tipped off a contact in law enforcement, feeding them just enough information to set up a sting. The hunters scattered, some caught, others fleeing into the night. Richard received the news with a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. His plan had backfired again. Maria was always one step ahead. The next day, Maria made her boldest move yet. At a press conference, journalists unveiled leaked audio recordings of Richard boasting about cutting corners, bribing officials, and mocking his own employees. The room erupted with outrage, microphones flashing, reporters demanding answers. Richard tried to spin it, claiming the recordings were fake, but the damage was done. Clips circulated online, shared by millions, each one tarnishing the empire he had built. Maria watched it all unfold from her small apartment, sipping tea with a quiet smile. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. She just needed the truth to spread. For Richard, the walls were closing in. Lawsuits piled up, investigations opened, and his once loyal allies began to distance themselves. He felt the empire he had built slipping through his fingers like sand. He still blamed Maria, of course. In his mind, she wasn't just a janitor with a military past. She was a ghost haunting his every move, the shadow that refused to leave. And he swore to himself that if it was the last thing he did, he would crush her. But Maria had already won half the battle. The world was seeing Richard Kane for who he truly was, and all she had to do was keep the pressure steady. She remembered something one of her old commanders had told her in the field. You don't win by charging in headfirst. You win by making the enemy fight themselves. Richard was doing exactly that. His paranoia, his rage, his reckless decisions were tearing him apart faster than Maria ever could on her own. That evening, Maria walked past the same parking lot where it had all started. The place was quiet, the air heavy with memory. She touched the concrete pillar where Richard had once tried to choke her, the cold surface grounding her in the present. She whispered to herself, "It started here. It'll end here too." She didn't mean with fists or violence. She meant with closure. Richard Kane had chosen this battlefield, but Maria was the one writing its ending. The city was no longer Richard Kane's playground. Once, people whispered his name with admiration, calling him a genius, a visionary, a titan. Now, they whispered it with disgust. His face, once splashed across magazine covers with glowing headlines, was plastered on screens with words like corruption, fraud, and justice pending. But Richard wasn't ready to surrender. He still had money hidden, allies in the shadows, and above all, pride. Pride that burned hotter than reason, convincing him that if he could just rid himself of Maria, everything would be restored. He became obsessed. Days blurred into nights as he studied her, hiring anyone who claimed they could find her weak spot. But Maria was careful. Every move she made was deliberate, every step measured. She never let her guard down. What Richard didn't understand was that Maria didn't need to hide. She wasn't afraid of him. She was simply waiting. The final confrontation began on a rainy night. Richard had arranged to meet a city official in the underground parking lot, the same place where it all started. He believed the official still owed him loyalty, that a bribe would keep investigations quiet. But when he arrived, briefcase of cash in hand, the lot was empty except for the echo of his own footsteps. He muttered under his breath, irritation growing. Then he heard it, the steady tap of shoes against the wet cement. He turned, and there she was. Maria, calm, composed. Her eyes locked on him with the same steel as that first night. You, Richard spat, his voice trembling with anger. You've ruined everything. Do you have any idea who I am? What I've built? His words cracked, his face twisted with desperation. Maria didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the storm. I know exactly who you are. A bully, a thief, a coward hiding behind money. And everything you built was on the backs of people you treated like dirt. You thought you could choke me into silence. But I don't stay silent. Richard's hand twitched, as though he might lunge at her again. But something in her stance stopped him. The way she held herself, steady and unyielding. For a moment, the billionaire who had once thought himself untouchable felt utterly powerless. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. What do you want from me? He shouted. Money? Power? Is that it? Maria shook her head slowly. I don't want anything from you. I just want the truth to speak louder than your lies. Almost on cue, the sound of sirens filled the night. Red and blue lights flashed at the entrance of the parking lot. Richard spun around in shock as squad cars pulled in, officers stepping out with determined expressions. Maria had timed it perfectly. The evidence she and Louise had gathered had finally reached the right hands, and tonight, the law had come for Richard Kane. No, this is a mistake. Richard screamed, backing away as officers advanced. She set me up? She's nothing. She's nobody. His voice cracked into a desperate plea, but no one listened. The officers read him his rights, cuffing his wrists as he thrashed and shouted. Maria stood silently, watching as the man who once held her by the throat was now dragged to his knees by the weight of his own crimes. As he was led past her, Richard's eyes locked on hers one final time. There was no arrogance left, no pride. Only the hollow glare of a man who had lost everything. You'll regret this, he hissed weakly, though even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. Maria didn't answer. She didn't need to. His fall was answer enough. When the lot grew quiet again, Maria let out a long breath. The rain tapped gently against the concrete, washing away the echoes of Richard's rage. She picked up her mop, which she had brought almost as a symbol, leaned it against the same pillar where everything had started, and smiled faintly. Full circle. The next morning, news outlets erupted with footage of Richard Kane's arrest. The mighty billionaire, once untouchable, was now facing charges that could bury him for decades. Workers who had once suffered under his thumb gathered in celebration, their voices finally heard. Protest signs turned into cheers, and Maria watched it all from a distance, blending into the crowd. Just another face in the sea of people he had once dismissed as nobodies. Louise called her later that day. You did it, he said, pride in his voice. Maria shook her head. No, he did it to himself. I just reminded him that power built on fear never lasts. As she hung up, Maria walked past the shelter where she often volunteered. A young janitor she had spoken to before recognized her and smiled shyly. Hey, thanks for what you said the other night. About not letting people treat us like we're nothing. I needed to hear that. Maria smiled back, her heart warming. Remember it, she said softly. No one decides your worth but you. Life slowly returned to normal. Maria wasn't in the headlines, and she preferred it that way. She went back to simple routines, her days quiet, her nights peaceful. But something had changed. The woman who once tried to live in silence had found her voice again, not through shouting, but through action. And though Richard Kane's empire had crumbled, Maria knew there would always be more like him. Men who thought power made them gods. And for them, she would always be ready. Because she was more than a janitor, more than a soldier. She was proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, strength is quiet, patient, relentless. And in the end, it always prevails. If this story gave you chills and kept you hooked till the end, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that will leave you speechless. Your support means everything, and trust me, the next story will be even more shocking.